All right. So, yeah, is
now we're
this just
live.
gonna... Oh, okay. Hey, everybody. How you doing? I was, mid-sentence, so that kind of took me off guard.
Sorry.
No, that's alright.
So yeah, I watched through the series you did. I assume most people will be aware you did, along with Filthy Heretic. You guys did a series
Yeah.
on Hermann Hoppe, and you had some criticisms of his work. I've just gone through that series briefly earlier today to kind of get, I'd say, the main points of contention I have with your criticisms. So I
Yeah, that's
suppose,
fine. I figured though that it would be more productive to, like, for the reason for anybody who's watching why this is a free-form discussion rather than a debate on that topic specifically, because that's what the original, that's originally what Liquid Zulu, and I am interested in debating that point, but in researching and like setting up for having this stream with Zulu, I realized there were going to be quite a few points of contention over methodology that I figured it would be better to probably just to discuss various topics on a stream beforehand.
yeah,
In order
definitely,
to
yeah.
clear up.
I mean, this will definitely allow us to maybe narrow down a point of contention which we could maybe debate further in the future rather than setting out with a single point of contention which we might not even end up having a true contention over, right?
Well, yeah, I don't think ultimately that, I don't know whether or not this is the case with you, or even most people in your, or even, my audience, would necessarily, like the people in my audience who are, like, still ancaps or paleos, would necessarily, not find our ends to be contentious in concept, and that's a very important thing that I would like to establish. But digressing for a moment, my main disagreement ultimately with the paleo movement and what is referred to as like the thin libertarian crowd, it is specifically that the content of the concepts relating to libertarianism, so like what they mean in relation to an argument justifying them, is determined specifically by what within this internal reasoning causes them to emerge. And I think that in the thin libertarian position, which I refer to as specifically the notion that it doesn't matter that these concepts just exist in a vacuum, and you can justify them in like a Neoplatonistic kind of universalist framework where you just try to define something and then apply it to aspects of nature, aspects of like your environment around you, and see how well it works. And I take objection with that.
I'm not sure if I understood the thrust of the criticism there. So you're disagreeing with like the kind of Hoppe, paleo, thin libertarian, sorry, type of thing.
Yeah, well, this is a problem with the paleo movement as well, but for different reasons, but broadly, broadly, this applies to the thin libertarian position as well. So, like the ANCAP movement, the Libertarian Party, people who are approaching their understanding of concepts relating to libertarianism from a political perspective or a Platonistic epistemological framework. And my issue is, like, my issue first and foremost with these positions is that if you don't, it is that they don't have any way of explaining necessarily like what justifies property. They can explain what it is, but in terms of demonstrating what causes property to be a valid concept, or the methodology that the methodology that can allow a certain act to be considered property, that's up for debate. And we see this within a lot of libertarian circles, where the biggest issue the biggest issue, sorry if there are a lot of, sorry if I'm having a lot of thought buffers, I'm just trying to find a way to, describe what I'm trying to articulate.
Yeah, that's fine.
In simple terms. But, the way that, the biggest sense in which we see this is within paleo circles in particular, whether or not something like IP or corporate law would be considered valid property claims. They don't have... There is no way within the paleo movement specifically to distinguish between, say, a corporate title or IP fundamentally and any other kind of property, because they've accepted the notion fundamentally that property is a legal concept, and because property is a legal concept, what counts as a claim is determined by some title issued by a third party. And in most cases, from the paleos, this is the arbiters running being managed by the covenant community, and this fundamentally creates a problem, because that's... You don't have any basis for property rights here. You have basis for the legal concept of property, but if I were to homestead a resource, and my actions indicated that this was a legitimate claim, so I didn't act on a resource that was being acted on by anyone else, and what I'm claiming is an actual scarce, rivalrous resource, so it's something that I could definitely point to as if it is being acted upon, then I am being deprived of it. Then fundamentally that should be, from my perspective, what determines a claim. And I think this is the Rothbardian perspective as well. But this is up for debate when you start trying to incorporate a legal theory into libertarianism.
Well, I would just say I disagree that the fact that it's a legal theory of property rights, that implies that these property rights have to come from a claim issued by a third party. The Hopian theory of property rights are that they are conflict-avoiding norms. This doesn't require any sort of third-party arbitrator to decide who has the property right. It's just set forth by the laws of logic. Whoever was the initiator of the conflict doesn't have the property right, because we're looking for conflict avoidance in our property right norms.
But how do the norms emerge within the Hopian perspective? And this is one basis. This is the main basis in which I find myself arguing with paleos the most, is that, and Hopians in particular, is that there is this assumption that goes into Hoppe and later Rothbard's work in particular, property norms are something which are not decided. Not I shouldn't use the term decided because I'm not really. Let me rephrase that. Because I'm not trying to describe some sort of arbitration process. That norms are something which exist outside of people acting upon resources, and that norms are something that are determined and outside of society and are sort of imposed onto people who are actually organizing in those societies. And I think that there's an issue with trying to describe social norms in this way, because firstly, that would imply that social norms could exist independently of actual human action, which I think, considering that social norms, they specifically you relate to and they specifically relate to how people are organizing with their resources and how people associate with one another. I don't see how that could possibly be the case. But also it suggests but also to characterize social norms in this sense suggests rather ironically that it suggests rather ironically that you could have norms imposed onto any given society through fiat property and through political institutions, and it's those institutions that determine how social norms emerge in those given societies. And I think that I don't think that if a political institution in, say, Saudi Arabia were to start trying to impose anti-Islamic social norms onto people, that would go over smoothly.
So like the root of that was, well, we're looking at how do the norms emerge? Well, the answer is, from the Hopian perspective, is they emerge out of the logic of argumentation, argumentation ethics.
Well, there's
so you were saying there that there's an assumption
from the Hopian perspective, there isn't a difference between between fiat property and property as an action, which is how the agorists would look at what determines what a claim is. If I'm acting on a resource, then the nature of my action on that resource determines whether or not I'm making a claim. And if I am in the act of trying to exclusively defend this resource, doing something that makes it so this resource I'm doing something that it is not defensible. Not defensible in the sense that there's something about my action that makes it so this can't be a claim. Say the resource is already being claimed by somebody else, or trying to defend that claim exclusively would infringe upon someone else's existing property claims. Then it doesn't count as a claim, in which case there's nothing wrong with somebody defending themselves against that particular claim, and that would count as an act of self-defense because it's not a legitimate claim. From the Hopian perspective, and this is why I brought up fiat property in the start, there isn't any sort of methodological basis for property. There's just property is something that is a right, because people claim resources, and what counts as a claim is up in the air, and what counts as property consequently is up in the air because there's nothing that causes them to emerge within this particular framework of argumentation.
So I suppose I'd just like to know what you define fiat property as opposed to property as an action.
Yeah, I would be glad to get into this. So, and this is one of the main reasons that a lot of people misunderstand my position, but this is one of the reasons why I criticize capitalism as a political economy. So within the perspective of fiat property, what I mean by fiat property is property as being characterized within a legal framework, meaning that you have a state and you have a state's political organization that is influencing the norms that that people can make claims around because the state has a monopoly on all of the resources that people associate with in that particular society, and because they have both a monopoly on security and a monopoly on finance, so they're able to control supply. They're able to not really getting too much into how political planning works, but because of this, but just long story short, because of this, what counts as private property when a state exists, and according to the state, is not necessarily something a claim that is defensible. Because it could, whether if, for example, someone were to make a claim over land that conflicts with a homestead, so someone that actually acted upon the land and that was unowned and is trying to exclusively defend it through their own acts. The fiat property norm would be, regardless of this, whoever has the deed to this arbitrarily defined plot of land, and the state will unilaterally defend this claim this contract that was created and is legally recognized by them. So that's considered private property, but at least legally, but it's not defensible property from an ethical standpoint.
Well,
and
I would just say this, this idea of fiat property, the reason why, maybe you see as Hoppe doesn't make a distinction between fiat property and property as an action was because he only calls property as an action property. So there's no need to talk about fiat property because it's just not property. It's not a conflict avoiding norm.
Well, the problem though is that his specific epistemological approach to trying to characterize property, and specifically in trying to defend property as a within a legal context. That's the purpose of setting up a covenant community within the Hopian perspective, is to defend the libertarian property norms, the quote unquote libertarian property norms and social norms. But from this perspective, there isn't any way of distinguishing between property as an action and fiat property, and that's my main criticism.
Well, you absolutely can characterize them as differently in a natural legal point of view. Is basically what you do as well. Is this claim, were they actually the initial appropriator of some means that they're claiming a property right in? And if they're not, then they clearly don't have a property right, because if somebody else comes along and starts using it, they aren't initiating conflict with them because they aren't the initial user. They might be initiating conflict with someone else, right? Let's just take Crusoe and Friday. Crusoe sees a stick in a tree, takes it off a tree, sharpens it up, and he wants to go ahead and start using it to spearfish. And then Friday comes along, and he sees that stick that Crusoe has, and Friday thinks, ooh, that would be great for stoking my fire. And then Friday takes the stick off Crusoe and wants to use it for stoking his fire. Well, we know this is actual natural property right, as opposed to some sort of fiat property right, because it's a conflict-avoiding norm to adhere to this property right. We derive the property right from the fact that Friday would be the one initiating the conflict, and Crusoe would not be the initiator
Well, you're
of conflict.
And the problem with this is that you're conflating the norm that emerges with specifically what property titles are defensible. The problem with this that emerges is that you wouldn't have any way of if you were not going to distinguish between property norms and what's right, then you wouldn't have any way of explaining how states emerge as some sort of conspiracy to create artificial property norms. And if you were to see Democracy the God That Failed, Hoppe explicitly characterizes states as organizations that were originally covenant communities. Which honestly, I think that there's validity to that, and more, in a way that he may or may not have intended. Because a state fundamentally is a conspiracy between a militia firm and a reserve bank, but that's a different subject.
So the problem with the Hopian notion of property is that if you adopt it, then you have no way of explaining how states emerge.
Well, you wouldn't have any way of distinguishing between political fiat and the act of making a claim, and you don't have any way of doing this specifically because of the way that norms are characterized, and the attempt to justify property as a category that transcends how it emerges and then is justified by trying to work backwards and seeing what applies to it.
Well, you absolutely do have a way to distinguish between political fiat and actual property rights, because actual property rights arise out of conflict avoidance, whereas political fiat doesn't arise out of conflict avoidance. So that's a good way to distinguish between those two sets.
Yeah, but firstly, what within Hoppe's reasoning would justify this characterization, and also what counts as conflict avoidance?
So what would justify
why
the characterization I've made of his argument?
Yeah, what counts as conflict avoidance, and why does that emerge?
So a conflict is when two men attempt to implement something towards contradictory ends, right? So we go back to the stick. Crusoe and Friday. Crusoe wants to use it for spearfishing. Friday wants to use it for stoking his fire. Well, those ends can't both be simultaneously, attained, because the stick is scarce. They can have conflicts over its use, i.e. the use by one excludes the use by another. So there can be conflicts over the stick, and there's a conflict when it's being attempted to be implemented by two men towards these contradictory ends. So if we have this, then we have conflict avoidance, i.e. the NAP. So we're trying not to initiate these conflicts. And because we're trying not to initiate conflicts, we say that, well, the initiator of the conflict is the one who is wrong in any given conflict. And we denote this by saying that the property right is assigned to the person who didn't initiate the conflict.
So what count? But again, what is specifically the basis within the claim? At least within the Hopian perspective, what counts as a claim, and how exactly do you determine what counts as a claim over a resource?
Well, it's when you're trying to,
Because that's going to determine what counts as conflict and like who the initiator is.
So a property claim would be something like when you're the initial appropriator over something. So, you're the first person to come along and begin implementing it as a means towards some end.
So why can't I say that? Why can't I say that IP counts as property then? Or why can't I, with a group of people, why can't I, with a group of people, create a political organization, then create a guild system and recreate artificial property like corporate law in order to allow an organization model to scale upwards that wouldn't be possible without imposing some artificial property norm onto other people as a third party.
So why IP doesn't count as property is because ideas aren't scarce. That you can't have a conflict over the use of an idea, so there can't be property rights in ideas. And I'm not sure what you mean by corporate law exactly. So,
But that could be, well, firstly, what I mean by corporate law is the legal status of a corporate entity which exists in modernity, um, which exists specifically because the state is able to create arbitration as a type of firm because it has a monopoly on what counts as security, and therefore markets which otherwise wouldn't be able to scale up on a unipolar scale, um, you see, the same price for commodities in every single economy, regardless of the people actually acting in those economies. That's another reason you say this, but digressing back to the concept of property, you said that by your standard, by the Hopian standard, that you still haven't provided a basis for what counts as a claim, but you're saying that IP is some. You're saying that what counts as a claim. Your attempts to explain this is something that could be employed as a means to something that could be employed as a means towards an end.
well,
Well, what?
I did give a basis of what counts as a claim. I said it's when you're the initial appropriator, i.e., the first person to start implementing something as a means towards some
Oh,
end.
right. That was how you characterized it. My bad. I I'm sorry, I forgot because of explaining corporate law. But yeah, going back to this, well, because this standard doesn't emerge out of any sort of methodological framework. It is the basis for trying to just this this particular concept in a Platonistic way is made up, and then it's applied to other things in an attempt to describe them. There's no way to show exactly how this standard emerges, and therefore there's nothing based on this standard that would stop someone from characterizing an idea in the way that you've described the basis for a claim.
I mean,
Because what justifies an idea being separate from property within this framework doesn't have any sort of coherent methodological connection. As far as the internal reasoning is concerned, it could just be taken as a non sequitur.
well, I mean, I don't understand why you keep saying it's Platonistic. It strikes me as very Aristotelian, Hoppe's argumentation ethics. I mean, the general structure, at least, is Aristotle.
It's distinctly the opposite. The Platonistic method, is the polar opposite of the Aristotelian one. The Aristotelian method, the Aristotelian epistemology, I should say, determines what counts as a concept based on what is caused for what is required to cause that concept to emerge, and ruling out competing possibilities, and ruling out as many ruling out essentially every other option, and then from there determining what the nature of the concept is. Platonistic epistemology is to define a concept, uh, not really based on anything, but to base what the concept means off of trying to apply it to other subjects, and then from there, if it describes those subjects well, at being using that to determine what counts as the nature of a concept. And you can see based on uh, his Hoppe's understanding of norms, and Hoppe's understanding of social organization in particular, that he's not using an Aristotelian epistemological framework, because all of these concepts don't really have any sort of coherent methodological relationship with one another, from ethics to other aspects of social study, for example. And Hoppe pretty explicitly, has a couple of position, like he's a defender of genetic determinism, for example, specifically through defending Lamarckian evolution. And as a result of this, as a result of defending the deterministic stance on the question of will, he doesn't really have any basis for justifying the concept of agency, which means that methodologically there's no way of coming to the conclusion that you can have any sort of standard of evidence for what counts as a claim.
I mean, the basic structure of argumentation ethics, is that not basically Aristotelian negative demonstration? You say, well, you look at what it would take to propose the counter, and you'd find yourself in a contradiction. So therefore, the counter of the counter must be true, i.e. what we were initially proposing, libertarianism.
Yeah, but there's nothing within this internal reasoning that causes those original assumptions, those original concepts to emerge. It's Platon. If anything, it's Platonism loosely masquerading itself around this methodological framework. But ultimately, you're still in the same position where these concepts are just presumed to have these properties, and then applying a deductive analysis to these concepts that initially have these presumed properties to begin with. And Hoppe pretty openly defends presupposition, which is distinctly not Aristotelian.
I mean, I'm not saying he's an Aristotelian all through, right? I'm saying argumentation ethics, at least its basic structure, strikes me as quite Aristotelian, because one of your criticisms there was that there's nothing within the internal reasoning of argumentation ethics that causes the original concepts of argumentation ethics to emerge. But the thing is that argumentation ethics it's not relying on some prior
are we talking about argumentation ethics, or are we talking about just generally these concepts as characterized by Hoppe? Because that's a completely different subject. Argumentation ethics is specifically a form of discourse that is proposed to it is proposed to justify his methodology. These concepts are specific. These concepts, as we're discussing them, um, are conclusions that are reached within within his internal reasoning.
Well, we were talking about the root of property rights in the Hopian sense, and that root is argumentation ethics. So this, we go right down to the root of, property rights are conflict avoiding norms. Okay, why should we care about conflict avoiding norms? Well, because to try and propose anything else, you'd contradict yourself.
Okay, and the problem with this and this gets back to some of the criticisms that I've, been making throughout the stream. Well, for the main one being that there's no difference within this, or at least there isn't any clearly defined, not clearly, there isn't any way that it is shown clearly that property norms are different from the act of claiming property itself. This is
again,
why
there is a way to do that.
It doesn't distinguish between different claims. It just homogeneously characterizes any act exclusively. It just creates this category of resources that are defined as exclusively claiming a thing without someone else claiming it first, but there's no basis for determining what counts as a claim. No basis for.
Well, there is that basis. I've given it a few times now. It's that when you're the initial appropriator of something, that is the basis for knowing whether you're, having a just claim over something, i.e., the initial possessor. If you're making in general, if you're making a property claim, that would be something like, I don't know, you're trying to possess something. You are actively attempting to implement something as a means towards some end. Then you're making a claim that you are the just possessor of that thing. And we know who is correct in their claim that they are the just possessor. A few ways. Argumentation ethics is Hoppe's way. Misesian regression is Kinsella's way. Basically, whenever anybody's having a dispute over anything, they presuppose that ownership is different to mere possession. So they're saying that a latecomer to their possession would be unjust. So we have it that it must be the initial possessor who is just.
Okay, but what counts as a claim to begin with doesn't. What I think seems to be getting lost here is that what counts as a claim to begin with is determined by the action that's taken to cause it to emerge, and that's not made clear within argumentation ethics.
I mean, how is that not made clear?
Or at least there isn't any basis for characterizing what counts as property here, because there isn't any basis for characterizing what counts as property here, because what counts as property is just this normative category. This normative category of property, and that's not something that emerged out of anything. It's just something that is. It's just something that is I don't want to say made up, but something that is retroactive, that information and the world around the particular person making the claim retroactively applies to everything around them. Also, I thought that this was going to be a discussion about epistemology, and we were going to talk about argumentation ethics later.
I mean, this is just a general chat about Hoppe, right?
I thought that this was going to be a general chat about I didn't really. There wasn't really a clearly laid out clearly laid out idea for what this was going to be other than just a topic stream, so I guess, I mean, you could attribute it to being my bad for not being more specific, but I wanted to discuss, I wanted to discuss methodological justifications, which is why I've been so interested in exploring that, but we keep coming, around to every time I'm attempting to do this, I'm simply provided with an explanation of something as though that answers my question when I've made it explicitly clear. The problem is that if you can't derive this from anything, when you're talking about social studies, if you can't derive a concept from actions that would be taken to cause it to emerge, then you're essentially talking about something that's arbitrary. There's no reason that I can't simply characterize something else as being this concept and it having equal explanatory power.
I mean, from where do you derive the action axiom then?
Because of the fact that well, in modernity, people are moral agents, but this could apply to other beings if they could demonstrate sapience. But because something is a moral agent, this means that it's capable of understanding what a claim is, and thus a burden of proof applies to it for what counts as a claim.
I mean, then what exactly does it mean to be a moral agent?
Being which has sapience and therefore is capable of internalizing its actions in such a way that it can actually understand. It can think of itself as an agent, and it can think of what it is acting on as a claim. And how sapience is determined is, in a being able to, pardon the redundancy, but being able to express that it has a sense of self, being able to recognize itself as something that is different from its environment and actually internalize a narrative about itself.
So a moral agent is a being who's able to recognize itself as different from its environment.
And create an internal narrative about itself and demonstrate this.
Okay, but how does that imply that the action axiom is correct?
Because it means that they're capable of recognizing what a claim is, and therefore whether or not they're making a claim can be known by them, and therefore if they are acting upon something, like if they're acting upon another person, or they're acting upon resources being claimed by another person, they can recognize that. They can understand that that is another person's claim, in which case it's at least possible for them to understand that their actions can be legitimate or illegitimate and can't count as a claim. Now, that, by the way, doesn't create a basis for establishing a norm. That's not what I'm trying to justify, and that's not what my position is. I think that social norms surrounding property I think that social norms surrounding property, in terms of what property emerges, is going to be, at least in the absence of political organization, so without a state or a covenant community or any sort of monopoly arbitration, is going to be determined by is going to be determined by the actions and interests of the people in a given economy, and and to and I don't think that the notion of conflict avoidance necessarily has to apply to this, because incentives to commit violence only exist in modernity, specifically because of the state creating this monopoly on security, and and essentially defending people who commit crimes, or allowing organizations to scale upwards by externalizing their maintenance costs and defending them from people who would try to defend their claims from those organizations trying to make claims to their resources.
So, a moral agent is a being which can recognize itself as different from its environment and make an internal narrative for itself, and therefore it can recognize what a claim is. I just want to know how exactly that follows from the fact that it can recognize itself as different from its environment and make an internal narrative. How does this imply that it can recognize what a claim is?
Well, if it's capable of recognizing itself as a being, then this means that it's capable of recognizing its actions as something beyond just I see food, I take it, I want to go to sleep, I go to sleep here. It's capable of understanding, of creating an internal narrative for itself, and therefore it's capable of understanding that there are other beings too, and that those other beings are acting on resources, and those may or may not be other moral agents. And
I mean, this sounds kind of circular to me, because you said if it's capable of recognizing itself as a being, then it's capable of recognizing its actions as something beyond I see food, I take it. But that implies you're presupposing that action is a thing there. But you're trying to show that this implies that actions are a thing.
it's not it's not circular, because what I'm saying is not that it has any sort of intrinsic recognition of what an action is. This is it has to create an internal narrative for what action is, because the nature of information itself makes it impossible for communication to be one to one. And if something is a moral agent, then it necessarily is going to be able to it's necessarily going to be able to create a narrative for what its actions are.
But then you're presupposing that there even are such things as actions. If it can create a narrative for what its actions are, then there must be such things as actions, which presupposes the action axiom.
I'm not presupposing that actions exist. I'm not presupposing that actions exist. I mean, I suppose we can get into what counts as an action, but action is something that an action being something that is an action being essential, well, there are different kinds of actions. You know, there's rationally informed actions, where and then there's involuntary actions, which, you know, in the praxeological analysis, I'm just going by how Mises characterized these different kinds of action. But
mean, surely there couldn't be involuntary actions, because action is purposeful behavior, and if it's involuntary, then it's by definition not purposeful.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it is purposeful. I'm just saying that there are different kinds of actions, so I can't really I'm not going to be trying to characterize action as some homogeneous thing. But the concept of action is the concept of action is not necessarily exclusive to moral agents. What is exclusive to moral agents is the ability to create a narrative around what their action is. And but action is not really like it. It's kind of hard for me to find the words to describe it, which is why I'm not. Which is why I guess I would say I'm kind of fumbling here.
Well, I can give you my derivation of the action axiom and the standard derivation if it would maybe help spark your mind. It's basically, well, to try and deny the action axiom, you'd have to be engaging in an action, which presupposes that action is a thing.
Well, the problem though is that that's a presupposition, and so that can't work to justify.
Exactly. To try and deny it, you presuppose it. That's what makes it an axiom. Is that in trying to deny it, you have to use it. That's why it's undeniable.
But that doesn't justify the concept. But that doesn't justify the nature of the concept. All that does. I
mean, I'd say being undeniable is a pretty good justification that it's a thing.
But the problem though is that doesn't create a justification for the concept of action. That's self-referential. If you're denying the nature of action that justifies the nature of action, that's just no.
If you're trying to dispute the action of the thing, if you try to dispute the
problem,
you'd fall into a contradiction, because we know contradictions are false. The negation of a contradiction has to be true. So i.e. the action axiom has to be true. Purposeful behavior.
And but not all behavior is purposeful.
Right. Okay, but then if it's not purposeful, then it's not an action.
I suppose we could broadly characterize it as behavior.
No, we could categorize it as purposeful behavior. It's the specific subset of behavior which is purposeful.
Sorry, hold on, I dropped something, but the problem though again is that relies on a presupposition, and that can't be used to demonstrate the nature of
this
action
transcendental argument doesn't rely on any presuppositions. It's the person who's trying to argue against the action axiom who is presupposing that action is a thing, and therefore they're contradicting themselves, and because we know contradictions are false, the negation of their proposition has to be true.
But that's the problem with transcendental arguments, is that they inherently themselves have to presuppose that the concept that they're trying to rationalize has a basis for justification, and their justification is in trying to argue against them. You have to engage. You have to assume them to be valid.
Well, that's not a presupposition, though, right? That's just a fact.
It is a presupposition, because how do you know what you're talking about is action if the basis for what counts as action is if you deny it, you're engaging in it?
Do you disagree that it's the fact that in order to argue against action, you'd have to act?
I don't disagree that action exists. I disagree that that's a basis for justifying the nature of action.
Right, but do you disagree that in order to argue against action, you'd have to be engaging in an action?
in terms of we're speaking in terms of trying to justify what counts as the concept of action here, and in doing
Well,
that,
right now we're just trying to derive the action axiom, not say exactly what action is. Right, so
well,
it just is the case that to try and dispute anything that is an action, you are engaged in purposeful behavior.
what I would base the notion that I would base the notion of action existing on is the demonstrable observation that behavior exists.
Just because behavior exists, that doesn't imply that action exists, because, you know, animals behave, but they don't act.
Well, it means that you're acting upon a resource, and again,
No. Again, behavior doesn't imply that you're
which
acting.
well, you can exclusively claim a resource, or you can use a resource through your behavior, and and you can interact with resources because of behavior, and that's the basis of action.
I mean, bees interact with...
And again, that doesn't imply. I'm not saying that this implies the fact that action exists itself is the justification for sapience. I'm simply saying that this is the justification for the concept of action.
Right, but I disagree that it is, because bees certainly engage in behavior, but not purposeful behavior. They're like automatons. They interact with nature all the time, but not purposefully.
That's not rationally informed action, sure, but it is
Right, so therefore
it is
behavior doesn't imply action. Because there are things which engage
does.
in behavior which don't act.
There are different kinds of action. I mean, people who are moral agents engage in involuntary actions all the time, and this
If
is
it's involuntary, it's not an action, though, is my point. If it's only action, if it's purposeful behavior, that's the definition of action.
I guess that I would disagree with that because of the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance or classical programming, or at least that's a justification for action.
I mean, how does that debunk action as being purposeful behavior?
Because it shows that you can engage in involuntary behavior within your own internal reasoning, perceiving it to be rationally informed behavior.
Well, let's say that, you know, you told me that if I do a rain dance, then it'll rain tomorrow, and I believed you. And so I'm still acting when I engage in that rain dance. I believe that dancing will attain my end of making it rain, right? I'm still acting. I might be wrong about that I'm going to attain my end, but I'm still engaging in purposeful behavior.
What I mean by rationally informed behavior is not something that is logically inconsistent. I mean that the behavior is informed by the internal reasoning of like there being a sort of internal reasoning that goes into that behavior, and they think that this behavior is achieving an end that they can end that they've plotted out and see as being attainable as a result of employing these means. So I'm not saying that like a rain dance doesn't count as rationally informed behavior. What I'm referring to, for example, is the use of psychological programming to cause someone to build an internal narrative of information relating to, say, society around them, that causes them to only be able to, as their only frames of reference, essentially fix what counts as introspective thinking, and anything outside of those parameters, and if anything outside of those parameters is perceived by the person, it immediately shuts down the part of their brain that engages in this thought process through cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it sets up some sort of domain from which they will. I'm a determinist, you know. I think you will always choose to do the same thing in any given situation, but I think therefore psychological programming is completely analogous to you telling me that if I do a rain dance, it will rain. You know, it's a lot more in depth than that, but it's basically just conditioning you to believe something which may or may not be true, right? But you're just altering what people will choose.
Not, though, because it's maintained fundamentally by an involuntary response that the person's not conscious of. Anything outside of this arbitrary parameter causes a cognitive dissonance response, but within the internal reasoning, the person that is operating within that narrative believes themselves and cognitively is engaging in rationally informed thought.
Well, let's just assume that, because I'm not a psychologist, I'll just assume for the sake of argument that psychological conditioning does indeed make you, you know, engage in behavior which is involuntary, i.e., not purposeful. You know. Well, how does that imply that action isn't purposeful behavior then? Because then these conditioned behaviors aren't actions; they are, because they're not purposeful. So how does this imply that action isn't purposeful behavior?
But that's the problem, though, that I'm trying to point out, is that and we see this in mass with, like, the NPC phenomenon. More specifically, I would refer to that as politicization, though I haven't put out any material about that, but I will be pretty shortly. But we see this in mass with, you know, the what a lot of people refer to as the NPC phenomena, and also how people are programmed to approach information because of government schools. But but digressing, the problem that this presents with that with that transcendental understanding of what counts as action is that you have behavior which would, within that internal reasoning, both count as rationally informed behavior and involuntary behavior.
I mean, you have to be wrong there, because that's a contradiction, right?
But that's exactly but that's exactly my point. Because you've created this, because you're trying to take this Platonistic transcendental approach, something that we could demonstrate to be the case based on what can be shown to cause these things to emerge, the properties of these things. It's not a contradiction because it can exist, and I agree. Contradictions can't exist, because if contradictions could exist, that would mean that that would mean essentially that anything up to and including their antithesis could count as a description for something, and that would mean that, you know, that would mean it doesn't have any discernible nature.
I feel like
that's my point, is that this justification for the concept of action falls flat because of this, because contradictory contradictory bases could simultaneously be considered valid as a justification for as an understanding of what action is.
I feel like you're sidestepping the argument here, because the initial point was that, well, programming, psychological programming debunks action as being purposeful behavior. And I'm saying, well, like, let's even assume
Let's
that psychological programming is involuntary behavior, i.e., it's not purposeful. How does this debunk that action is purposeful behavior?
Oh, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I'm not sidestepping the argument. I'm focusing specifically on your epistemological justification for action, and I'm pointing out for this notion that action is purposeful behavior. And the problem, and I'm pointing out one of the problems with it within its internal reasoning.
Right, but the way...
And it's not my argument isn't that psychological programming refutes it. My problem is what I'm pointing out is that there are observed behavioral states which can count as both involuntary and rationally informed.
Right, I mean, you're kind of introducing this atom of rationally informed. I don't think... I'm not the one introducing it. I'm saying action is purposeful behavior. If it's purposeful, then it's action. If it's purposeful behavior, that is, then it's action. I don't care whether, on some sense, the person believes that they had rationalized it, because you can rationalize something after the fact. We see this all the time in free will studies.
Yeah, well, then purposeful, because when I'm using the term rationally informed, I'm referencing what rationality means in the praxeological sense.
Okay, so when you're saying that there are behaviors which are both rationally informed and involuntary, you're saying that there are actions which are both purposeful and non-purposeful at the same time.
Right. So this, according to that transcendental justification for action, which means that it can't be valid, because that's a contradiction.
Right. So how does this argument for the action axiom imply what would be a behavior which is both purposeful and non-purposeful?
Well, I just spent the last few minutes going over that. People who act upon a political understanding of society, because of this internal narrative that's constantly reinforced through both artificial incentives manufactured through political planning and constant narrative engineering being pushed by the state through media and its schools.
I mean, how would that be non-purposeful? Just like with the guy who's doing a rain dance, he's misinformed on whether or not a rain dance will cause the rain to occur. I don't think it will cause the rain to occur. He thinks it does, but it's still purposeful action. And similarly, if the cathedral is pushing these narratives onto you that XYZ will do ABC, that's still purposeful behavior. You're just misinformed on whether or not your end will actually be achieved.
Well, first and foremost, it's because you don't have the ability. It's because while you're following these particular lines of thought which conform to the narrative, you engage in praxeologically rational behavior, and you're also able to introspect on the nature of concepts within that narrow conception of what they could possibly be. But as soon as something is presented, such as the state is an organization and has organizational, as soon as a prospect like agorist class theory is presented, then it's not even really conceivable within that internal narrative. It needs to be introduced by an outside party, and considering the emotional and financial investment that people have in political institutions and their legal market jobs, because of how integral that is, because while the state exists to maintaining their lifestyle, that is going to trigger a cognitive dissonance response, because it's going to be perceived as an attack against them. Anyway, can we take a 5-minute break, because I just really need to go to the bathroom really quick.
Sure, I've got your last point there written down so we can jump right back into it.
Alright, I'll be right back.
So, boop.
DJ Cutman here. You've been listening to a preview of Joshua Morse's Vlad, coming out this Sunday on Game Chops. It's a 4-track tribute to the music of Castlevania, and the first time that the jazz fusion producer has taken on EDM. He does it with a power that you'd expect from a Game Chops release, so keep your whips cracking and head over to GameChops.com and download Vlad.
I'm back.
Alright, yeah, I'm really sorry about that.
No worries.
Normally I try to wait, but it wasn't it wasn't happening, and I'm not I can't bring myself to I'm not the kind of person that's gonna sit with a fucking bottle next to my computer, so that I can continue streaming.
So yeah, so you're saying that there's, in this transcendental argument for action, there are purposeful and non-purposeful actions implied at the same time. So people who act upon that it's implied that there can be actions which are both purposeful and non-purposeful. People who act upon a political understanding of society because of this internal narrative that is reinforced through artificial incentives pushed by the cathedral, they're going to have this. So I'm saying, how is that non-purposeful? It's because while you're following the lines of thought that conform to the narrative, you engage in praxeologically rational behavior, and you're also able to introspect on the nature of concepts within that conception. But as soon as something is presented against that narrative, it's not conceivable because there's cognitive dissonance. And I would just say, well, it's not conceivable to tribesmen who have been rain dancing all their lives, they won't believe you when you say that the rain dance doesn't work, because they've seen it work before, right? They're gonna have cognitive dissonance there as well, right? But it's still purposeful behavior. Just because you're gonna have cognitive dissonance to try and conceive of the truth doesn't mean that it's not purposeful behavior.
Well, cognitive dissonance is not, it's an involuntary response that happens when something is presented that, challenges one's internal, perceived sense of interest. And if you were to provide, if you were to provide a tribesman, cloud seeding technology, or you were to simply demonstrate that this isn't a method, at least if we were to assume that this was that this norm of rain dancing emerged because that's just genuinely how they believed that you caused rain, and wasn't itself the result of some sort of artificial structures being reinforced by fiat. There's nothing that would causally cause that cognitive dissonance response.
I mean, I imagine
that's why
I imagine a tribesman would have cognitive dissonance if you started trying to convince them that rain dances don't work. I really imagine they would have cognitive dissonance there.
Well, if you didn't have anything to undermine the basis of that narrative and substitute it, yes, you would, because that's what causes cognitive dissonance ultimately.
No, even if you do undermine their narrative, they're just going to wall themselves off. That is cognitive dissonance 101.
And substitute it with something that they perceive as being beneficial to serve the same purposes.
Right, but okay, that doesn't mean that they're not going to have cognitive dissonance when you start showing them a bunch of studies or whatever that rain dances don't work. They're going to be like, no, I've seen it work plenty of times.
It does, because cognitive dissonance happens specifically because people have at the very least, modern people can associate and in mass do, because of the way that people approach information. Not just information, but the way people contextualize information as being any information as being inherently tied to how they evaluate their own sense of self-interest. A belief system becomes interchangeable with how one perceive, especially within political narratives where the norms created by some institution determine directly whether or not they'll be able to maintain themselves. But but this happens because people conflate what's true with what their sense of self-interest is and their ability to preserve themselves. So if you were to provide a substitute,
that does happen with
cloud seeding technology or something, or simply demonstrating how basic botany works to a tribesman, and showing that you can grow crops consistently, that shouldn't trigger this response.
I mean, you've been a libertarian for a while. Surely you know better than most people that presenting people with the truth doesn't necessarily get them to agree with that truth. That's the marking characteristic of cognitive dissonance. I mean, if it's the case that there wouldn't be cognitive dissonance for these rain dancers when you show them, these alternative ways to get rain to fall, then why wouldn't it be the case that there wouldn't be cognitive dissonance for these NPCs who follow the political narrative all the time?
I'm not talking about I'm not necessarily talking about like persuasion through discourse. Um, I'm referring, that's one particular approach, not a very effective one because it doesn't necessarily, even if you are, providing a substitute, at least through discourse, you're explaining, a counter narrative, uh, that would better demonstrate this, at least from your perspective, because of the nature of communication. That's not necessarily what they're taking away from what you're saying. There is no intrinsic context for information. But you can disrupt the way that certain organization is able to be carried out, and substitute it with something that people adopt because it suits their utility better, or because they have more use for it. That's why I referred specifically to, um, I didn't say. That's why I made it, pretty. I made it a point to refer to demonstrating botany through growing crops or by introducing cloud seeding technology, because in that situation, that's how you would get past the cognitive dissonance response.
So the crux of your argument is that, and correct me if I'm wrong here,
This
that cognitive
this isn't
dissonance
even
for NPCs implies that in one behavior, they are engaged both purposefully and non-purposefully at the same time.
Well, this was just a discussion of like the nature of cognitive dissonance, at least over the last 5 minutes. But
Right, but we're applying it to your derivation that my argument for the
right.
Action Axiom
And this is
contradictory.
this is what I was getting to, that you can have something which is not you can have something which is not maintained through praxeologically rational thought. By something, I mean a narrative. And you can and based on how the brain is functioning and how you're approaching context, you can be through your behavior, you can be acting upon this as though you are engaging in rational thought. So it's both, according to this transcendental justification for action. Action could both be something that's voluntary and involuntary. Doesn't necessarily mean that it is, but but that argument has no way of resolving this conflict.
So you can have something that is not maintained through praxeologically rational thought and is based on how the brain is functioning, you can be acting upon this as if you are engaging in rational thought. But I mean, in what sense are you engaging with it as if you were engaging in rational thought?
Because you're not conscious of the parameters that cause cognitive dissonance to be triggered, and when you are within the internal reasoning of this narrative, um, reflecting upon it, you are simply engaging with these concepts in the sense that you would be in the sense that you are engaging in, at least, like, while your cognitive dissonance response hasn't been triggered, um, with that frame of reference for what these concepts refer to. You are engaging in rationally informed introspection over the nature of those concepts. But problem is, the parameter of those concepts and what could inform them is limited by something that the NPC is not capable of being conscious of.
So it's that there are parameters outside the NPC's consciousness which are informing what they are even deliberating
Yeah,
upon.
it's not a conclusion that they came to on their own. It's a product of narrative engineering.
So they have this parametric domain within which they are still able to act, but outside that domain, they're engaged in non-purposeful behavior by definition, because they aren't actually rationally thinking about it.
Yeah, when you get a response from someone who is politicized, when they're responding with something like, if you were to get rid of the state, then we wouldn't have any way of defending ourselves. We would have warlords, or what what about the roads? That's an example of this. And that's the reason, by the way, why it's the exact you get the exact same response from virtually everybody, down to how the responses are phrased.
So,
That's an involuntary response, and
whi-
it's because they associate societies existing with political institutions maintaining themselves.
so where exactly is the intersection between these two sets? You know, the NPC has a parametric domain, where outside this domain it's non-purposeful, and inside it is, but where's the intersection between these?
Well, I mean that's going to be I mean that there isn't really a universal way of determining this, because that's the problem with trying to create any sort of general approach to any sort of discourse based approach to trying to undermine this. And that's just what I mentioned a second ago, which is that communication is not of concepts is not one to one. You could be creating a rhetorical model that is demonstrating exactly how something emerges, but if the person that you're communicating this to is not going it is not if the person that you're communicating this to um sorry, let me rephrase that. The person you're communicating this to, just taking out the if, they could they could be internalizing a completely different understanding of, like, they could be having a completely different mental picture of what's being presented to them, informed by the narrative which is disconnected from your own, that's already been established. You would have no way of knowing this either way.
So,
And in the case of the trouble with the way that people who are politicized, um, the trouble is that they're projecting their own sense of self-interest onto what political institutions actually do, because political narratives of society assume that everything which exists is maintained as a result of the state's fiat norms that it creates and defends.
I mean, if there is no universal way of determining where the intersection of these domains lies, then, how on earth are you determining that this intersection even exists?
Well, you can. Well, I was able to identify that the first point it sort of caused me to, and this is something that is it's sort of newer uncharted, not uncharted territory, but notion that like this is inherent to political discourse itself, is something that I noted. But there is precedent for there is precedent for people coming to this conclusion, just not ascribing it to politics. But digressing, well, first thing that tipped me off to the fact that this exists is because the fact that every single person responds the exact same way when you've sort of roughly treaded upon these parameters where you are breaking down the association between society and political organization. And specifically because of what I just mentioned a moment ago, the nature of communication, making it impossible for every single person to either know or come away with the exact same understanding of information being presented to them. It automatically suggests that something more than individual rational thought is going on when every single person, regardless of whether or not they know one another, in response to the exact same line of questioning, replies with the exact same thing. That only really happens when you're dealing with like subconscious responses.
Well, I mean, what about
And
the ancaps who also always respond to these arguments? You know, what about roads and all that bullshit? The ancaps are responding in very similar ways to all these counter arguments. So are the ancaps also not engaged in rational thought?
well, it depends on specifically who you're talking about, but this is why I refer to politicization and not I didn't use the term statism because I'm not referring to the same thing, and I'm coming increasingly to believe that what a lot of people are referring to as statism is actually politicization. And where I'm going with this is that you see this exact same sort of response emerging even within uh, self-described philosophical libertarian circles, because a lot of people who describe themselves as libertarians are still operating within a political narrative of society.
I mean,
You did it earlier in this conversation when I was referencing the nature of political organization determining these things. So it's not necessarily ideological, and and whether or not these institutions have any sort of uniform ideological leaning. It's kind of irrelevant to whether or not this is going to happen. This is going to happen more because of economic planning and the power that the state holds over the lives of people who aren't acting within the state. But
are
no,
you
you referred to this as the cathedral, which is a concept that explicitly implies that this is the result of some sort of internal political interest being expressed through these institutions. And,
so? I mean,
that is itself a political narrative.
my argument against that would be, well, I mean, common arguments will tend to go in similar ways. They'll tend down similar paths. I mean, are you familiar at all with the game of Go?
Game of Go?
Yeah.
I guess elaborate, because...
I can make the same point with chess, I suppose. You know, in chess there are, in high-level games, it's basically always the case that people are starting in similar ways. Similarly in Go, there are basically, there's a limited set of proper openings, we could call them. If you just start somewhere retarded, you're not going to win. So in high-level play, you're going to have this limited set of moves which people are opening up with, right? And similarly in arguments, when you have people who, at least on some level, understand the argument, they're going to go down a similar path, right? And this doesn't imply that they're not rationally thinking. It's just that there will be one choice of how to respond, which will be better than some other choices. And so you're going to tend towards the better choices of counter-arguments rather than the shit ones. And the more you understand the argument, the better you'll be able to select for the set of good counter-arguments. So this is definitely rational thought here.
Well, the first problem that I have with that is that when you're talking about chess, or when you're talking about any other board game, you're speaking about action within a framework where there are already predetermined rules for how to play the game, and that's not and likewise.
I'm just kind of making an analogy. There will be some set of valid counter arguments that you could make to any given argument, and some of those will be better than others, right? And so there'll be a subset of the good counter arguments, we could say. And the more you understand the argument, the better you are at narrowing down this set of good counter arguments for you to choose from. And so the more people understand something, they're going to tend towards a certain path that the argument will go down. I mean, I experience this all the time. I've had many debates about anarcho-capitalism, and they generally, what their problems are, it'll generally go down a similar path. This doesn't mean that neither party is actually rationally engaged with the topic. It means just that there are simply some arguments which are better than others. If somebody said, well, without the state there wouldn't be roads, and I responded with, well, roads don't even exist, that would clearly be a shit counter argument, right? So I'm not going to say that. It would technically still be a counter argument, but I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say something like, well, I mean, the free market can make roads, right? I'm going to tend towards arguments like that, arguments which are better rather than arguments which are worse. And you could, theoretically, if you argued enough, you could map out an entire tree of every potential argument which could go on. It's just that, the argument we're having right now, it's fairly niche, so we both don't have prior experience with this type of argument. So we're kind of thinking on our feet. But if we had a lot of prior experience with this type of argument, whichever one has, we would be recognizing that similar arguments would crop up, because people are generally going to pick arguments which are better than arguments which are worse. It is entrepreneurial, of course, so there will be variations here and there, but that's always the case with every argument. There will be some variation, but it's a tendency towards better rather than worse arguments.
Well, and this is what I was getting to, is with like, you have this sort of same issue when you're referring to just the references to concepts within certain, or references to methodologies or epistemological frameworks which have some sort of some sort of esoteric, just meaning there's a long line of people who've argued within it and interpreted it a certain way. You could point to and read. The problem, though, with trying to compare this to discussing the political nature of society, or arguments relating to, like, deconstructing that association between society and political organization, is that this sort of response is first of all by every person responded to in more or less the exact same questions to it are responded to in more or less the exact same way. And when you're talking about people who, without any sort of cognitive dissonance, are just discussing the validity of concepts, they may be familiar with the arguments and the basis for how these conclusions relating to those concepts emerge, but you're not going to get the exact same rhetorically structured responses from every single person in that kind of discourse. But also, there aren't any unless you're going to say that the people making these NPC responses could point to some sort of source that every single one of them is familiar, it is familiar with, and every single one of them used to inform their association between society and politics, which, in my experience, asking them that kind of question either only further triggers cognitive dissonance, or or they're not able to not able to tell me. But
Right. So,
yeah,
would you agree that these people at least understand like the basic principles of argumentation?
no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that politicized people are uninformed or unintelligent. What I'm saying, or the point that I'm trying to make, is that there's clearly some sort of programmed internal narrative and there's plenty of basis that one could point to support how this emerges, because there's subtext in virtually every single piece of media, which steers people towards the exact same understanding about the nature of these concepts. This I just posted in the Discord voice chats. An example. I was actually just talking about this with someone in my Discord server, and that's from just the first CNN article that I found on their website, and literally within the first paragraph, there's 3 examples of subtext that push these particular this particular framing of society in relation to the state. But and this in but because you have all of these like weird psychological manipulation techniques that don't even really, honestly, this doesn't even really count as, or at least it's questionable as to whether or not this even counts as propaganda, because it's not conclusion that's being pushed onto people. It's steering how people inform their conclusions without them even being conscious that this is what's happening.
Right. So
And this is how a lot of people end up finding themselves in falling into politicized narratives. At least I would argue.
Right, so there is this programmed internal narrative, and, similarly in Go, there will be this conditioned set of moves which a person thinks would be viable, and this narrative will change as you more understand how Go works. But, if you at least understand the basic principles of Go, you would know, well, it's probably a good idea to start in the corner first, because then you can more easily secure territory. And, similar to chess, it's probably a good idea to maybe do some, I don't know much about chess openings, but move a pawn 2 pieces forward, right? And the more you understand, my the way I'm relating this to argumentation is these people who respond in similar ways to ancap arguments, they at least understand the basic principles of argumentation. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I would argue that when they are in that when they haven't had cognitive dissonance triggered, they're capable of engaging in rationally informed thought, of course, in the praxeological sense, just meaning that they have a specific end in mind that their means are working towards employing, but of course, because people that are politicized can't even really explain why they associate society and political organization, or why they project political interpretations onto everything that is happening in the world around them, or has some sort of political significance, by which I mean the ideology, there being some sort of political interest that's determining how these come out. It's not just the state functioning as usual, or some sort of norm that emerged naturally out of interests of people in society.
Right. Okay, but I feel like you're sidestepping my counter argument here. I'm just trying to get down. Do you or do you not believe that these people who are arguing against ANCAP in similar ways, do you think that they, at the very least, understand the basic principles of argumentation? That there are some arguments that they have this inbuilt feeling that some counter arguments will be better than other counter arguments. Do you think that they understand that principle?
Well, I was trying to I wasn't trying to sidestep the argument. I was just getting to why I don't necessarily think that characterizing this as principles of argumentation would be valid, and B, that I don't really think that when they're arguing against against a libertarian perspective, that even if they understood what the libertarian perspective was in a philosophical sense, or like what informs it epistemologically, that they're capable of doing anything other than projecting a political interest onto them. And we see this with Marxists, really any group that is politicized, depending on who they are. If you're arguing for a justification of how libertarians understand the nature of concepts, you're a capitalist shill, you're a libcuck subversive. This is them trying to ascribe political narratives onto the act of negating a political framework. Which, by the way, I don't think that the ANCAP movement successfully does, because it doesn't have the ability of distinguishing between markets and capitalism.
Right. So, I mean, you can have like quabbles over the semantics of calling it a principle of argumentation, but I mean, do you think they at least understand that there will be some better arguments and some worse arguments?
I suppose in a very general sense, sure, but do they have control over the context they use to inform this? I would seriously call that into question.
Right, okay, but if they at least understand that there will be some better arguments and some worse arguments, it would surely be the case that there would be some sort of coalescence, because human brains are all pretty similar, right? So it's going to be pretty similar, and how these people, and based on the programming they've received, it's going to be pretty similar what subset of possible arguments they think will be good counter arguments. There's going to be a lot of overlap in this set that people come up with.
Yeah, but if they don't have control over what they consider to be an ideal response, then you can't consider that a praxeologically rational action.
I mean, if it's the case that, there's going to be this overlap, a large overlap in what people think are good counter-arguments, then how does this imply that it's going to be the case that, well, they're not actually acting because they're responding in similar ways, but that's because they're all selecting from a very similar set of arguments that they think would be good counter-arguments.
Because it's because the association between these concepts isn't made consciously. It's made through emotion. It's made through psychological manipulation via subtext, or through the artificial incentives leveraged over people. At the very least, these exist, and therefore, because they exist, you have to take them into consideration, that coupled with the fact that there isn't any sort of intrinsic rules to how people process information, and there can't be because of the nature of communication, coupled with the fact that you get the exact same responses in response to people prodding certain parameters of certain subjects, then and you can determine roughly what those are. Because of that, it seems as though chalking this up to a game of Go. There are factors here that make that unsatisfactory as an answer to what explains this.
Well, I mean, you're trying to show that because they are choosing similar counter-arguments, that they therefore are both acting and not acting under this transcendental argument for action. But I mean, I can give a trivial counterexample where it's simply the case that these people are coming to similar conclusions on what the set of good counterarguments would be, right? So how is the fact that they are choosing from a similar set of counterarguments, how does that prove that they both are and aren't acting?
That presupposes though that their responses are rationally informed.
No, I'm not presupposing it. I'm giving a counterexample. You're trying to prove that they aren't rationally informed. But I'm saying, well, how do you know that just by the fact that they are choosing from a similar set?
Your counter argument, though, your question in response to that is to invoke the notion that they could simply be choosing these responses in a rationally informed sense just because they're the best responses to make in an argument that's supposed to be demonstrating how these are rationally informed responses.
Right, it's a counterexample, so why does my counterexample fail? How can you prove, just by the fact that they are choosing from a similar set, that therefore they didn't rationally come to that set?
Because part of your argument supporting your conclusion presumes that your conclusion's already valid.
No, it's a counterexample. I'm not assuming that it is the case that they did rationally come to this. I'm saying, right, you are showing that, well, because they are choosing from a similar small set of counter-arguments, that therefore they didn't come to this set rationally. But I'm saying, how does that imply, just because they are choosing from a similar set of counter-arguments, how does that imply that it is the case that they didn't come to it rationally? Because how is it the case that they, maybe didn't just come to it rationally? Maybe that is just a proper set of counter-arguments.
I'm not saying that they are. I'm not saying that they are choosing. Specifically, what I'm saying is specifically my point is that because of the nature of communication, it is suspect that the exact same responses are being invoked in response to the exact same.
Well, that's just not the case, because given the nature of communication, there will simply be some responses which are better than others. I go back to the roads example. Somebody says, well, in ANCAP, who would build the roads? And I say, well, roads don't even exist, buddy. That would clearly be quite a bad counter-argument. If I said something rather like, oh, well, I mean, roads aren't exactly some crazy technology. Why is it the case that the free market couldn't come up with a way to make roads, right? That would be a better counter-argument than me saying that roads don't exist. And I know this, I understand this, and I assume most ANCAPs would understand this. It's not very difficult to come to this conclusion. And I came there rationally. Rational justification, rational narrowing down of this subset of good counter-arguments is entirely possible, because there are some arguments which are just simply better than other counter-arguments, right? So how do you know, just because they're selecting from a similar small set of counter-arguments, how does that prove that they didn't come to that subset rationally?
We're just going in circles here, but you keep characterizing my position with a response or you're responding to it with a line of questioning that already presupposes that the point you're trying to demonstrate is valid. I'm
absolutely not presupposing anything here.
The point that I have made is that because you have this uniformity in responses. They're not similar responses. They're the exact same responses down to how they are phrased.
Well, they're not the exact same, right? There is some variation there. If I say ANCAP is better, some people would say, well, no, there's a social contract. Some people would say, well, who would build the roads? Some people would say, well, who on earth is going to make sure there's equity or whatever? There's a bunch of different responses.
It's a small subset of
exactly, and that subset, I'm saying, what if they came to that subset
the exact same way as
it's not phrased the exact same way though. It's not the exact same way. It's in a similar way. That's why I'm calling it a subset rather than a single counter-argument. Because people don't come to the same single counter-argument.
I mean, how do you ensure roads are built? What about the roads?
Yeah, they're similar, but not the same.
Pretty much the exact... It's basically the exact same response.
So it's some small subset of answer classes, we could call them, counter-response classes.
But they are phrased I suppose I should clarify what I mean when I say phrased the exact same way. They're not all literally saying, what about the roads? Although, like, the vast majority of for the vast majority of them, you could like screenshot them and compare them side by side, and
I agree that they're similar.
The exact same response. No, most of them it's the exact same response. But my point is,
I agree that if they were talking in Lojban, they would probably be saying the exact same thing, right? But that's my point. There is so they've come to some very similar subsets, right? There's a lot of intersection in their subsets, right? I agree there.
But it's the exact same response.
I talked to Kurt Doolittle the other week, and his counter-arguments against ANCAP were very, very different than most people's counter-arguments. His counter-arguments were stuff like, well, ANCAP is, it comes from Jewish ethics, yada, 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 all sorts of crazy bullshit, right? He comes up with some
I'm not
crazy
saying
shit, right? And there are
I'm
some
not
people who come up with
saying that.
crazy shit because they have come to a very shit set of counter arguments. Most people come to a fairly similar set of counter arguments because that's just the logical progression they have gone through, you know. And they're wrong; their counter arguments are wrong, but just based on what they already know, they come to a very similar subset of counter arguments. So why is that? How do you know that this is false? That they didn't rationally come to the subset? How do you know that this was programmed into them?
Okay, but what I've been trying to express, and just what I was trying to clarify is that the wording may be slightly different, but it's the exact same responses, and you don't see that kind of uniformity unless there is a singular master narrative coupled with singular uh, um like singular economic incentives that are being imposed upon people, because the economic incentives will dictate sort of what what they associate with their parameters of like how they evaluate their interests, and the narrative will give them points of reference to retroactively just internalize those points of reference as being associated with those things. But what I was getting to is it's not similar arguments, it's the same argument but worded slightly differently. And in the case of
I get
Kurt
that.
Doolittle,
I get
I'm not
that.
saying that every single argument is identical. Case in point, I have, my own argument against the ANCAP movement, and I'm explicitly not politicized. But I'm saying that there is, for a good chunk of the population, I don't know how many, but it has to be, like, considering that this is, like, even the majority of the self-described philosophical libertarian movement. Like, I've had Hopians respond to me with "What about the roads?" in response to critiquing the notion that political organization is something that could
Right, I imagine they haven't
could
read much
exist.
Hoppe. Right, that's a problem with many people who love Hoppe. They don't fucking read any Hoppe. Right, but I mean, you're saying that they necessarily had to
My
come from a master
my point
narrative, but how do you know it came from a master narrative and not simply the reality that some arguments are better? Like, there isn't a master narrative in Go which tells you start in the corner. It's just simply
because
better to start in the corner than to start right in the middle, because you can more easily
because
encircle
board
territory in
games
the corner.
It's because board games have fixed rules and fixed ends that everybody who's playing the game um, will have to play in accordance to, uh, regardless of their interpretations of the rules, or specifically how they interpret the game. Whereas that's not the
Well,
case with.
it is the case with argumentation, though, is that argumentation has
It's not,
certain
though.
normative presuppositions. Whenever you're engaging in an argument, you're engaged in a propositional exchange, i.e., you're trying to
And I don't.
demonstrate that your opponent's argument is false and that your argument is correct, right?
I don't
So
agree
that
that
sets up the board. That sets up the Go board. It's very much larger than a Go board, I agree, but it's still analogous to a Go board, a very, very large Go board. It would still be the case that it's better to start in the corner than right in the middle.
Okay, and I disagree that there are normative presuppositions to the act of arguing, but even, like, aside from this, the fact is that because of how there isn't any sort of intrinsic context that can be derived from information itself, it means that the context that people are, ascribing to information is determined specifically by their internal narrative of how these of the nature of these concepts. And what that is something that, and what that is, everyone has one. You have to have one in order to even in order to even process information and create narratives for concepts around you. But because of this, even if you could justify concepts through presupposition, doesn't mean that everyone can even necessarily come to that same conclusion about what the meaning of these concepts are, and what the implications of them are, or what's entailed by them. Well, we're talking about presuppositions, so entailments are irrelevant. But even if that were the case, that still would, even if that were the case, that would still raise this massive question of why down to the exact same phrasing and framing of these questions are people parroting these exact same responses. And you can't say that, it's not analogous to a board game, because board games have predetermined rules that limit what people can or can't do. And you
Well,
could say
that's the same with argumentation, though, and this is why I want to get into the fact that argumentation does have normative presuppositions. Like, let's just take the trivial example of, well, if I'm engaged in argumentation, I necessarily have to accept that I ought to argue right now, right? Like, could I argue that I ought never argue?
Hold on, I was getting a drink.
Right, so could I argue that I ought never argue?
This is, and we're just getting back to the original arguments that started this conversation.
Right,
now,
because it's wrapped around, because
that's the trouble. That's the trouble. No, that's because that's the issue with presuppositions.
No. It's because you've said that
the meaning.
It's because you've said that it's disanalogous to go, because there aren't normative presuppositions to argumentation. That there isn't this go board setup of that where you could derive in some sense what arguments are better, right? So it's come down to this no normative presuppositions in argumentation. But would you not agree that a normative presupposition of argumentation would be something like I ought to argue right now?
And I disagree that you can derive meaning from presuppositions, because
okay, but would you agree that that is a normative presupposition?
If I don't agree that presuppositions exist, then I can't agree that that's a normative presupposition.
Which is why you're wrong that presuppositions don't exist.
How do you derive meaning from a self-referential concept?
I mean, do you simply not agree that when I argue, I have to agree that I ought to argue right now? Like, do you think it's possible, without contradiction, for me to propose that I ought never argue?
The problem, though, with the point that you're making and this presuppositional style of argumentation is that what it means to argue is determined by the entailed steps caused in rationalizing the concept, and whether or not those are valid. Those are based on something which can be demonstrated. And the problem with presuppositions is that you aren't really pointing to something. You're pointing to something that may or may not even be valid in the first place, and consequently it doesn't have any meaning. just saying something exists and what that something is, people just project whatever they interpret it to mean, because that's what happens when something doesn't have any sort of necessary methodology tied to it. You run into a phenomenon known as death of the author.
Right, so do you think, therefore, that it's possible for me to, without contradiction, propose that I ought never argue?
Depends on what you mean by argumentation.
I mean, whatever you mean, I'm engaged in an argument, right, to say that I ought never argue. Do you think that's something valid? Do you think I'm contradicting myself?
I think I personally would argue that I personally would argue that that's a contradiction, and
Right.
I could demonstrate why that's the case, but that doesn't mean that I have to argue that normative presuppositions exist.
Well, I mean, why
Is that
why would you say that that's a contradiction if not that you're presupposing that you ought to argue?
Well, I think that the problem with that, though, like I would actually even I would actually even defend I would make the exact same defense of that position, that this is an argument against the act of argumentation, so it performatively contradicts itself. But it's not a presupposition, though, because the act of argumentation is not justified by this being an argument. The act of argumentation is something that emerges out of it emerges out of something being in action, and the nature of action determines what argumentation is.
Right, so, I mean, so I couldn't propose that I ought never argue, so therefore the converse of that has to be true, right?
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that's not a presupposition.
Right, okay, but by the fact that I couldn't possibly argue that I ought never argue, when I argue, I have to hold that I ought to argue, right? Because it's a contradiction otherwise.
That is a well, no, just because the act of argument, just because you can engage in the act of argumentation doesn't necessarily imply any sort of normative value judgment.
Okay, but right, you're just restating your thesis here, right? If I were to try and propose that I ought never argue, it would be a contradiction. So the negation of that has to be true. I.e., I have to, when I'm arguing, I have to hold that I ought to argue right then.
Not just restating my thesis. I'm citing what I'm pointing to is the fact that I can engage in an act that doesn't justify a norm necessarily existing from the fact that I can engage in an action. And also, that the other problem with this is this gets back to categorical errors, which I sort of started off by pointing to. That action is not, argumentation, because it is an action, means that there are different kinds of argumentation, because there are different kinds of actions lead to argumentation emerging, and what counts as the circumstances surrounding that are important to take into consideration.
Well, I can give you the circumstances which would define an argument, right? So it's going to be some sort of interaction where two or more parties are asserting premises in support of two or more contradictory conclusions, where the goal of each party is to find out what the correct conclusion is. Right? It's specifically the method of solving disputes over truth claims through the use of peaceful means, that is, trying to convince your interlocutor through the force of their argument, rather than aggressing upon them, right?
That implies a whole bunch of That implies a whole bunch of norms are present, which you
Right,
haven't
but you disagree with this definition of argumentation.
Demonstrated just because I
But
can
do you
argue.
disagree with my definition of
I can-
argumentation there? Do you have a better one that you want to
I do
put
because
forward?
I just explained why. It implies that a bunch of norms are present that aren't necessary.
Okay, but why does that make it bad, right? Because why does the fact that this
Not
definition
saying that it
implies
makes
normative presuppositions, why does that
bad,
make it a
it's
bad
just-
definition? What's actually
there
wrong
are
with
a
this
bunch
definition?
Of conclusions being there are a bunch of conclusions being made from there that don't necessarily follow from just what you.
It's just a definition. I'm not concluding anything.
you've made.
It's just a definition. That's how I'm defining argumentation. Do you disagree with that definition?
I do, and I've explained exactly why. And you all.
Right, but
and
your disagreement there, your explanation was that, well, it implies norms, but that's exactly my point.
In that description of argumentation, you're implying a bunch of conclusions that, first of all, that your argument is trying to, the purpose of your argument is to try to demonstrate, but also that don't logically follow from what's been presented in your argument. You just have some people when they engage in action, can engage in argumentation. That doesn't imply anything about the norms surrounding their argument. Like, why can't I get in an why can't someone that's in a war zone get in an argument? I mean, it's not very likely, but there's nothing saying that it can't happen.
Well, I mean, I didn't say that a person in a war zone can't get in an argument.
Okay, so the norms surrounding argumentation don't necessarily have to be peaceful.
Well, no, when you're engaging in argumentation, it is a peaceful action. A peaceful interaction, I should say. I mean, if you disagree with my definition of argumentation, what's your counter-definition?
Peace is a norm, though. Peace isn't an action. It's an end that's been achieved.
It is a peaceful action, though. I'm not saying peace itself is an action. I'm saying argumentation is a peaceful action. Right, just as trade is a peaceful action.
That's my problem, though, is with that description, is that peace is an end. So to describe a means by its end is
peace
a
isn't necessarily an end. It's a descriptor on a given action. Action X is a peaceful action. Let's say twiddling your thumbs. That's pretty peaceful, right? And just twiddling your thumbs. That's a peaceful action.
Well, it's an action that can exist, or doesn't conflict with the end of peace being achieved, but but a means itself doesn't necessarily but that doesn't have to exist in the end condition of peace.
So I mean, what is your definition of argumentation? If we're gonna have a argument about argument, what is your definition about what argumentation is? If you disagree with mine, what's yours?
My understanding of argumentation is the communication between two different actors over a concept or premise that they're disputing, either through I don't have to specify, either through verbal communication or just gesturing, because that's both of those count as communication. Anyway, could I hate to ask again, but I need to go to the bathroom again. So can we take another break?
Well, it's getting kind of late here, and I was planning to go out, so I mean, we could wrap it up here.
Okay. Yeah, that would be fine too. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
for pausing, but yeah. Again, the fact that the notion that I'm disputing that you can rationalize the concept as you characterize it as a presupposition doesn't necessarily mean that I'm disagreeing with you. It just means that I'm approaching it from a different epistemological basis.
All right.
And as
well,
a result of that, it has different implications.
I think we'll just wrap it up there then, because I don't think we're gonna come to agreement on that. So I mean, anyway, thank you for coming on. I hope you had a good time.
No problem. Yeah, I had an alright time. Seems like we were talking past each other quite a bit, and I would have liked to have clarified that, but I think other than that, I didn't have that big of an issue coming on. I enjoyed talking.
All right. See ya.
Yep. Peace out.
Boop.